Hello, and welcome to the Funeral Trust Planning Conference Call. All participants will be in listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of today's presentation. An operator will give instructions on how to ask your questions at that time. If you should need assistance during the conference, please signal an operator by pressing star then 0 on your touch-tone phone. Please note, this conference is being recorded. Now, I would like to turn the conference over to Jack Alpern. Mr. Alpern?
Thank you, Amy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are truly excited about the new concept of doing teleseminars so that both you and I can remain in our homes and we don't have to venture out into the Northeast Ohio weather. We're recording the seminar so that it will be available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our website, and that should happen by Monday of next week. When we begin the question and answer period at the conclusion of our presentation, the tape recording will stop so that anyone asking a question will not be recorded. We want to encourage you to participate in the program tonight by asking questions, and we'll get to that in just a few moments. We feel that this is the beginning of a series of programs that we'll be offering through this medium, and we would encourage all of you to write or email us and let us know what you thought of the presentation and the concept. But tonight, we want to talk about one of the most overlooked areas in the planning process. How is your family going to pay for the funeral and final expenses in the immediate aftermath of the death of a loved one? There really is no doubt that our firm does, we feel, a great job creating a comprehensive estate plan looking after almost every contingency. But there's very little doubt that a document can do some things, but when a grieving spouse or distraught children walk into a funeral home to make arrangements, everyone agrees that that is not a time when family members should be making important decisions. And it all too often occurs, and that is exactly what has to be done. In addition to immediate decisions that must be made, family members are asked to write out large checks to get that process going. Well, where do they get the money for that? Who's going to pay? What guidance does a family have to make sure that it doesn't pay too much during that very stressful time? To make some sense of these, what we feel are very important issues, and to talk about an exciting new service that solves a number of these problems, I've invited Brian Adams, the President and CEO of Premier Planning, to walk us through the funeral and burial process that family members face immediately after the death of a loved one. Brian is actually considered one of the nation's leading experts on final expense planning, and he frequently speaks throughout the country about the importance of assisting clients to gain peace of mind through advanced funeral funding. I had the pleasure of meeting Brian at the American Academy of Estate Planning Attorneys Conference just about a month ago in San Diego. Brian, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate you having me on tonight. And as you know, I work with a lot of estate planning attorneys throughout the country, and your firm is one of the best that we work with. And I really appreciate you taking the time to host this teleseminar tonight and really confront one of the most overlooked planning needs. So I appreciate you having me here tonight.
Our pleasure, Brian, and I could tell when I met you and I listened to your presentation in San Diego that you've got a passion for helping families prepare for those final expenses. And I understand you actually were raised in the funeral business, and that
Yes,
your family still owns and operates several funeral homes. And I've heard you say that you're constantly amazed at how unprepared families are when a death occurs. I know that you've worked tirelessly to help Americans for the inevitable and lessen the burden on their loved ones.
Well, yes, sir. Yeah, my family still does own and operate funeral homes, and it is amazing how unprepared people are for this difficult time, even though it's one of the most inevitable times that occurs. And so we do have a great passion about helping families confront this issue and really helping plan to lessen that burden on their families.
All right, Brian, well, let's get right to it. First of all, most people have never had to personally arrange for a funeral and all of the work that involves. Can you walk us through what a typical family faces in the immediate aftermath of a death?
Well, first of all, it can be just one of the most difficult times of anyone's life when they lose a loved one. It doesn't matter how expected or unexpected the death is. It's a very traumatic time and a traumatic event on the survivors. The grief that occurs is simply unexplainable to most, and then you have to make a ton of decisions in a very short time frame while you're dealing with all of that grief. There's really an avalanche of decisions that have to be made in only a few short hours after death. You have to first locate a funeral home. You have to figure out who will be in charge of making all of the decisions and the arrangements. You have to decide on what kind of service to have. You have to purchase a casket or any other merchandise if it's going to be a traditional funeral. You have to try to locate any arrangements that might have been previously made, including if there were cemetery property already purchased. You have to decide on musical and scriptural preferences that will be used during the service and what kind of floral arrangements that we will choose to have. And then you have to make all the travel arrangements for family members that live out of town. Someone has to find all the person's important information that will be able to help them complete the death certificate, and then you have to decide finally how much money you're going to spend on the funeral, and then how you're going to pay for the funeral and all the other final expenses. It can, as you can see, it can be quite a long list of things that have to be done.
Brian, in your experience, how many families have actually pre-planned their funerals?
Well, you know, that is really an interesting question. Most estimates are that only about 12% of Americans have actually pre-planned their funeral, even though that they know that this is an inevitable life event.
What would you say are the traditional ways that most families handle final arrangements after a loved one dies?
Well, unfortunately, most families have to handle the final arrangements with little guidance after the death occurs. You know, it doesn't matter if someone has been sick for a long time or if the death was unexpected. Families are often just unprepared when the death occurs. You know, Winston Churchill once said that Americans are the only society that believes that death is optional. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's really true. We all think we're going to live forever and that it's never going to happen to us. And what happens is that we leave our families in usually a terrible predicament when that occurs because we haven't planned for anything. So to really answer your question, Jack, the traditional way that most families handle final arrangements after a death is to just simply go down to a local funeral home and let the funeral director tell them what they need to do. You know, and this can often lead to overspending and, frankly, very impersonal ceremonies.
Brian, I've read that there's been a lot of consolidation in the funeral home industry recently. What does that usually mean for families today when they attempt to do this kind of funeral planning?
Well, yes, there has been a lot of funeral homes that have sold to large corporations and other investment groups. You know, funeral homes are businesses, and there have been many companies that have tried to capitalize on economies of scale that can be achieved by operating a large number of outlets. And I believe that consolidation in the funeral industry has meant, frankly, a reduction of service to families. It has changed the industry's model from a service business to a traditional and typical retail business. And let's face it, consolidation and economies of scale may be okay for the fast food industry, but when it comes to helping a family through the loss of a loved one, you don't want someone continually trying to add to your order. The funeral industry has really transitioned from a community service-based business with local owner-operators that are very passionate about serving their families and their community to large corporate business with managers that have very little ties to their community nowadays.
Interesting. Brian, in my practice, I have seen cases where in the moment of grief, families often overspend on funeral arrangements. Has that been your experience as well?
You know, that's often the case. We all want to offer and honor the lost loved one the best way that we know how. And sometimes during that midst of grief, we tend to overspend to make sure that they have the best funeral possible. You know, there is really nothing wrong with this in theory. However, there are different ways that you can have a very dignified service and yet not overspend.
Okay, well, we've talked about all the problems and the stresses that families feel after a loved one dies. Let's move into the area of solutions. What are the most sensible solutions to this predicament?
Well, first of all, the most sensible solution to any problem, in my opinion, is to plan ahead. We all know that this day is coming for all of us, and we must be prepared so that we can lessen the burden on our families. Even though we realize that we must plan for a funeral, most of us don't want to go down to the funeral home and plan. So with this in mind, we've created a new service with your firm called the Funeral Trust. And the Funeral Trust is really an alternative of going down to the funeral home. The Funeral Trust has been designed to help people set aside the funds that they already have earmarked for their funeral expenses in the most protected environment possible. The Funeral Trust is funded through a guarantee issue life insurance policy by a highly rated insurance company. Now, this isn't like most insurance policies that you see out there, because there's no health questions or health exams or anything like that. Anybody can qualify regardless of health, even if you're in the hospital or have a health concern. We just use the life insurance as a funding method because the policy can then earn tax-free interest, and the benefits are also paid out tax-free because it's on life insurance. The Funeral Trust then can protect all the money from all creditors, nursing homes, probate, estate taxes, and even Medicaid.
Well, we're going to get into that in just a moment. Can anyone be too old to get one of these Funeral Trust life insurance policies?
You can, as long as you're 99 years and younger, you can set this up.
Okay. Now, having read about your company, in addition to the Funeral Trust, if I understand this correctly, you also provide every client with a membership in something called the Legacy Safeguard Service. What is that service, and what kind of help does it provide?
Well, Jack, thank you for bringing that up. This is something that I'm extremely excited about. And as you mentioned earlier, it's been a passion of mine to really help families through one of the most difficult times of their lives and to make funeral services more of a celebration of life. You know, there is a lot of planning that goes into a funeral ceremony, and most of us plan, 6 to 12 months when we're planning for a wedding. But we typically only plan and have about 6 to 12 hours when we plan for a funeral. Now, weddings and funerals are very similar events, but a funeral must be planned quickly and during an emotional time of grief. We need someone who is an expert to guide us through the entire process, and that's what we're able to provide with Legacy Safeguard. And whenever they set up the Funeral Trust with your firm, we're providing this for free with the Legacy Safeguard because we believe it's that important. I appreciate you providing that to your clients for free. Now, the client, whenever they set up the Funeral Trust and they receive Legacy Safeguard benefits, their family receives a lot of great tangible benefits. First of all, they get a Legacy Safeguard portfolio to help record the important information that's needed to complete the death certificate and to write down their personal wishes for the funeral service. Now, that can be stored in the Legacy Safeguard archives for as long as it takes and needs, and then whenever their family needs that, we will fax it or email it to them immediately so they have the important wishes documented in their hands right away. We also provide a Legacy Safeguard advisor to guide the family throughout the entire funeral planning process. We're on call 24/7 to help them whenever they need that type of a service. We'll help them locate a funeral home and even contact the funeral homes to evaluate service options. We recently had a family that the father passed away in Fort Myers, Florida, and the family was in California. Well, they called us up. It was a day before a major Jewish holiday, and this family was Jewish, and they needed to have a funeral home that was from a Jewish orient. And so what they did is they called us up and said, "Can you find us a funeral home in Fort Myers?" Well, that has a Jewish traditional background. Well, unfortunately, there wasn't one, but we found a funeral home that had a Jewish funeral director on staff. And then we also found the funeral home that had all the traditional burial methods for the Jewish faith. In fact, they even had a section in their cemetery for the Jewish faith. And so we helped the family throughout that entire process so that they had everything that was important to them so that they could travel all the way to Florida with that kind of peace of mind. In addition, what we did was we negotiated the price of that funeral with that funeral home even in advance before that family even took off. And we were able to save them almost $1,000 by negotiating in advance with that. So we also offer funeral price negotiation to help the family protect them from overspending during the midst of grief. We helped another family recently on a cremation service. They wanted just a traditional cremation, and the funeral home said that they wanted $4,000 for that service. Well, we got on the phone, and frankly, the family called Legacy Safeguard just to find out, are we getting a good deal? And that's really what they wanted to know, and I think that's what we all want to know. Are we getting a good deal here? Well, we thought that sounded a little too high, so our Legacy Safeguard advisors began negotiating with the funeral home and got them to get the exact same service that family wanted, and we got it down from $4,000 to $458 and saved that family over $3,500 just by taking them out of that sales-focused environment and letting us kind of help negotiate with that funeral home and help them save a significant amount of money. In addition, we helped a family recently save over $4,000 on a traditional burial, traditional funeral, and we got them the exact same casket, the exact same services that they wanted, but saved them a significant amount of money because of our industry experience in the funeral industry. Also, we support survivors. Our Legacy Safeguard advisors will tell them about different options that they have, including bereavement travel discounts that are available. You know, if you had to fly from one place to in the country to another overnight, then you'd have to pay a very high dollar for that price, and because you don't have 7 to 14 days advance notice when a death occurs. And so what some airlines provide are bereavement travel discounts, and so we can help the family understand different bereavement travel options that are available to them, and we'll even contact the airline to help them negotiate with the airline. Now, for that family I was telling you about that went from California to Florida, we were able to help them save over $600 per flight just through the bereavement travel discounts that the airlines saved. Now, I knew that this was a very important service, but it recently happened to my family. A couple of months ago, my grandmother passed away, and whenever she passed away, my family, my mom and dad, were in Europe on vacation. Now, they were in Amsterdam whenever we got a hold of my dad. It was his mom. And we were concerned that they weren't going to be able to get back in time for the service. Now, my dad's planned his entire life, planned funerals and worked with families, and that's been really his calling. But now he's concerned he's going to miss his own mother's funeral because he's in Europe. Well, we found one flight on one airline that would get them back in time for my grandmother's service. However, that flight was going to be $3,742 each for both my mom and dad. Now, my mom and dad said the same thing that most of us would say, is I don't care what it costs, just get us on that flight because we got to make it home for that service. But what I did was we handed this off to our Legacy Safeguard advisors, and our team went ahead and started working with that airline and got them a bereavement discount, got them on the exact same flight, exact same airline, exact same flight number, and got it down from $3,742 to $855, saving my mom and dad $5,800 just in money that they didn't have to spend by the bereavement travel discounts that most people don't even are not even aware that are even out there. And so we help families through that time as well. Now, we may not be able to help save everybody $6,000 on a flight, but we can help them in a lot of different ways, including grief counseling support. Sometimes the grief that accompanies a loss is just unbearable for families, and we can even recommend grief counseling support programs to help their family move through the grief that occurs there. So as you can see, I'm extremely passionate about how we serve families, and we provide this service through your firm free of charge anytime somebody funds their funeral trust.
Thanks, Brian. Let's assume that someone is interested in this and they contact us and they do a funeral trust. How does the family then know what to do when death occurs?
Well, when someone funds their funeral trust with your firm, then we automatically give them the membership in Legacy Safeguard for a lifetime membership free of charge. And we'll send them instructions on what to do when the death occurs. We'll also send them a membership card with a toll-free number that they can call at the time of, their family can call at the time of death. And that's answered 24/7. And then we'll dedicate a funeral planning assistant or one of our Legacy Safeguard advisors to the family to help them throughout the entire funeral planning process, to help them make the most informed decisions, to help them locate a funeral home, to help them negotiate the cost of the funeral, and help them even file the death claim with the insurance company. Now, funerals are very difficult times in any family's life, and we want to help them through the entire process so that we can just help them make it just a little bit easier on them. And we want them to focus on remembering their loved one, and we want to be there to help them figure out all the details that are required.
Brian, I've been told that when you prepay a funeral at a funeral home in the traditional sense, that you're locked in, so to speak, to that funeral home. And if your family wishes to use another funeral home, or if you have in fact moved out of the area, you cannot use the funds that are on deposit at that funeral home. Is that the same thing with a funeral trust?
Well, no, the funeral trust can be used at any funeral home in the country. So you don't, it doesn't matter if you've moved down south for the winter or wherever you are when that day comes, and we just don't know when that day is going to come for all of us. So it can be used at any funeral home in the country, and we'll help the family locate the funeral home and work through all the details as well.
One of the things I hear people very concerned about is getting the bill paid in a timely fashion. How fast does the funeral trust pay the funeral home?
You know, Jack, one of the most impressive features of the funeral trust is that the benefits are paid out next business day. So the money is really there for the family when they need it the most. Funeral homes require payment before the services occur, and the funeral trust pays out immediately.
Oh, so the funeral trust does not require a death certificate to pay the claim?
You know, that's one of the most unique features of this service is that the funeral trust does not require a death certificate. In fact, the funeral trust pays out the death claim next business day to any funeral home that services the family, and then it does not need a death certificate. Most of the time it takes several weeks for a family to get a death certificate issued, and then it takes another 60 to 90 days for an insurance company to pay out the death claim. And as you know, the funeral home requires a payment before those services occur. And so this means that families usually have to pass a hat around to pay for the funeral, or they have to put it on somebody's credit card. You know, this is the only plan that I have ever heard of that does not require a death certificate. And this is an incredible benefit to families so that they don't have to worry about the financial stress that occurs at one of the most difficult times in their life.
Brian, if someone decides they want to do a funeral trust and they decide on a certain amount of money that they want to devote to this, what happens if after the funeral, if there's money left over, if they didn't spend all the money in the funeral trust?
Well, any money that's not spent on the funeral is then paid back to the estate of the insured or to a secondary beneficiary, also next business day without a death certificate. So we'll pay out the funeral home that the family chooses first, and then anything left over goes back to the family or to the estate immediately.
One of the things that I'm sure everyone on the call knows is that we devote a lot of time to tax planning. So let's get to that. Are there any tax consequences to this funeral trust?
No, that's also a great feature. Since the funeral trust is funded by a life insurance policy, there are no tax consequences on the interest that the policy earns, and there's no tax whenever it's paid out. So it's protected from all current and future income taxes.
How would you compare the funeral trust to the, let's say, the traditional prepaid funeral plan at a funeral home?
Well, that's a good question. When someone purchases a prepaid funeral plan at a funeral home, they have to pick out all of the details of the funeral. They have to pick out which casket they want and all of the other items that go into the funeral. They also usually are pretty locked into that funeral home, as you mentioned before. Now, with the funeral trust, they can set aside the money that they want to use for their funeral, but they don't have to go through all the morbid details of planning their funeral. Now, their money is set aside and protected, and it'll be there for their family when they need it. And then their family will just be able to select the items that they want, and then for the funeral, and they won't have to worry about the financial stress of the funeral and final expenses. Now, we've met with many grief counselors, and they've all said that it's very important to have money available for the family to spend on the funeral, but that the family needs to have the opportunity to pick out all the goods and services that go with the funeral so that they can have some of that closure that they need. Now, the grief counselors that we've met with have said that the funeral trust is a much better option for families since they have the money sitting there for their funeral, but they can get the closure by being part of the selection process at the time of need.
Brian, I'm sure there are people on the call who are saying, okay, that's fine, but what does this cost? So are there costs to setting up a funeral trust?
Well, Jack, I understand that your firm is going to be giving the funeral trust documents to your clients free of charge when your clients put the money that they already have earmarked into their funeral trust documents that you set up. And I really want to commend you for doing that. I really think that shows how much of a priority that your firm has really set on this. So there are no charges. What they do is just take the money they already have earmarked and move them into the funeral trust that you're going to be providing to them. And then they have all the legacy safeguard benefits that we discussed as well.
If someone sets up a funeral trust, is there a minimum amount or a maximum that they have to put in or can put in?
Well, that's a good question. One of the great things about the funeral trust is that it gives you a lot of options. The minimum amount that someone can put in is just $500, and that's really what the insurance company requires is a minimum of $500, and the maximum is $50,000. And then the client can put in any number in between there. Now, you may ask yourself, why would somebody want to set aside $50,000 in there? Well, one of the reasons is maybe the funeral is only going to cost $10,000, but that extra money, as we talked about a minute ago, would go back to the family immediately so that it gets paid out next business day without a death certificate. So they have funds that they can pay for travel expenses or anything else that comes up at that time.
One of the reasons I felt so strongly that we ought to give this presentation is that I see many cases where my clients' health deteriorates. They go into a nursing home. They use all of their income and eventually all of their assets and then pass away, usually in the nursing home, leaving the family at that point with no money with which to pay for the funeral. Does this funeral trust offer any protection to the money that's set aside for the funeral and the final expenses?
Well, yes, the funeral trust offers the most protection of any advanced funeral funding option. The funeral trust protects the money from all creditors, nursing homes, probate, estate taxes, and it can even protect the money from Medicaid in the example that you mentioned. And as I've mentioned, when someone funds their funeral trust with your firm, we will also provide them with membership in Legacy Safeguard, which really provides their family with an advocate to guide them through the entire funeral planning process to make sure that they don't get taken advantage of. I think you'll agree that the funeral trust really provides your clients not only with a lot of benefits, but also with a lot of protection as well.
And getting back to that for just a moment, then, the benefits that are in the funeral trust would be safe and secure from the cost of a nursing home.
Yes, sir.
Well, can anybody qualify for a funeral trust?
Yes, anybody can qualify as long as they're 0 to 99 years old, and regardless of the health. They can be on oxygen in the hospital They can have any health issue. There's no health questions that are required. There's no health exams or anything like that.
Well, it sounds like someone could receive a lot by putting money into something like this funeral trust. Is that in fact the case?
Well, that's our goal. You know, it's been a passion of mine to help families through one of the most difficult times in their life. And the funeral trust, coupled with the Legacy Safeguard service, really offers clients a peace of mind knowing that their funeral's been taken care of and that someone will be there for their family to guide them through this entire difficult process.
Brian, you've given us an incredible amount of great information on what families can do to reduce the stress and what I found to be the uncertainty about planning for a funeral and looking after the expenses. Do you have any final words for the listeners?
Well, Jack, I really appreciate this opportunity to visit with you and your clients today. As you can see, this is something I'm very passionate about, and I hope that this information has been helpful and that more people really start planning ahead for the only inevitable life event. You know, this is one of the most important gifts that we can give to our family, and I encourage everyone on this call tonight and anybody else who listens to call your office to learn more about how they can protect their family with the Funeral Trust and Legacy Safeguard. But thank you very much for allowing me to join you and talk about this difficult subject, and thank you for really bringing this to your clients' attention.
Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate you being on the call. If this is something that you find interesting and worth looking into, you need to call us at 330-394-1501, or you can call our toll-free number at 1-800-307-5544, and we'll set up an appointment for you to come in and talk about this. This interview with Brian is one of a series of conversations with leading experts in business, estate planning, and consumer-related issues. You should check our website on a regular basis to see what upcoming calls will be offered. We'll also be notifying you by mail.
Hello, and welcome to the Funeral Trust Planning Conference Call. All participants will be in listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of today's presentation. An operator will give instructions on how to ask your questions at that time. If you should need assistance during the conference, please signal an operator by pressing star then 0 on your touch-tone phone. Please note, this conference is being recorded. Now I would like to turn the conference over to Jack Alpern. Mr. Alpern?
Thank you, Amy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are truly excited about the new concept of doing teleseminars so that both you and I can remain in our homes and we don't have to venture out into the Northeast Ohio weather. We're recording the seminar so that it will be available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our website, and that should happen by Monday of next week. When we begin the question and answer period at the conclusion of our presentation, the tape recording will stop so that anyone asking a question will not be recorded. We want to encourage you to participate in the program tonight by asking questions, and we'll get to that in just a few moments. We feel that this is the beginning of a series of programs that we'll be offering through this medium, and we would encourage all of you to write or email us